Our next guest was a naval aviator who saw the potential to create impact in finance and chose it as her next act. Hear what she learned from getting her wings, the integration of bottom-up and top-down thinking, and why what makes a true democracy might just make a solid investment too. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Julie Kane, who is CEO of Democracy Investments. The firm uses a proprietary algorithm to drive capital flows toward the economic growth of democratic countries and away from authoritarian states. Julie has had an over 20-year background in financial services, where she has developed market-leading innovations at Wells Fargo, Charles Schwab Advisor Services, SEI Investments, and Autodesk Ventures. She began her career as a US Naval Aviator flying the SH03 Sea King helicopter. Among her other roles, Julie is chairman of the board of Swords to Plowshares, a nonprofit helping over 3,000 military veterans, and she recently served as a captain in the California State Guard and helped fight the Dixie Fire near Tahoe in the last year. Welcome, Julie. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's start with your, what I think is going to be a fascinating background and career journey. Can you start with where you grew up, what you studied, and how ultimately you came to enter the world of investing and finance?
Sure. So I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia. I went to an all-girls high school, went to University of Virginia where I did naval ROTC and studied communications. And then later in life, I went to the Anderson School at UCLA for my MBA. At the time when I was in the Navy and I knew I was ready to move on to my next adventure, I was looking for an industry that would also be mission driven and have impact. And when I looked at the world of finance, I thought, well, if I'm not serving my country, what better way to have impact than helping to influence the finance world? And I was actually recruited out of the Navy by SEI Investments. And today our fund sits on SEI's platform. So I've kind of come full circle.
It's so interesting. It's not normally the first industry people think of for impact, but I do think that's changing. But at the time when you moved in, it was probably quite prescient of you to see that. And before we talk about that adventure, because that certainly is one, I'd love to hear if you had any adventures during your time in the Navy that you can share.
Oh, thank you for that. Yes. Have you seen the new Top Gun?
I have not, but I'm not always the first to see the new releases, but I would love to hear the real life version.
Well, when the first version came out, I was doing my midshipman training during college, and I was actually at Miramar, where the original movie is based. And I got to fly in an A4 and an A2 and just totally, I can't remember a more exciting summer. And that's when I decided I definitely wanted to be a naval aviator. And then after graduating and going to flight school, Desert Storm happened. So the Navy flight school is one of the best in the world, I would argue. And because they didn't have enough pilots during Desert Storm, we were flying. They doubled the pace to get more pilots through the queue. So that was very exciting. And then after my wings, as you know, the war ended quickly. And then we had too many pilots, so they had to take the bottom, I think it was the bottom 20% of the class and send them to the fleet. Luckily, I had the grades to continue on, and I was assigned to a squadron in the Philippines, right next to Subic Bay. It was called QB Point. And that's where we did combat search and rescue missions with the Navy SEALs. I did some rescues of Marines that got lost in the jungle. I was able to take medical supplies out to the victims of Mount Pinatubo. And some of my more exciting adventures, one, we had a compressor stall as we were on our way to have the Navy SEALs jump out. It was a very hot day. We were loaded down with 12 guys, and we weren't high enough for them to jump when the stall happened. So I was able to, as the junior pilot does the landing, and the more senior pilot follows the emergency procedures, kind of oversees. So I got to land that with all the guys in the back. And that was one of my favorite memories. And I also was able to participate in an exercise as a down pilot in the jungles of the Philippines. And I would say those were my top two exciting adventures.
Well, all I can say is wow. I don't know that we can even comprehend operating with those kind of stakes, because now that you're in the world of finance, I suppose it is only money, even though the stakes are high. What would you say you learned from working with those kind of stakes in those kind of life and death situations with so much riding on your concentration, your execution? I suppose, how did that shape you as a person?
Well, interestingly, because of my last name being Kane, I was assigned the call sign Hurricane and a few others you could probably guess. And that kind of style of being everywhere at once, I took in with me to the civilian world. One is I knew early on the importance of preparation and making sure everything that I could control in terms of my own preparation was under control. And I know you're a huge runner, and hats off to you for all the marathons you run. For me, I used running as a way to prepare, and I would run listening to my radio calls over and over and over so I could say them in my sleep. And that was one way, in times of stress, I didn't have to even think twice. The radio call just came out, and a lot of pilots would struggle. Some of them struggled with that. And that was one of my ways of being prepared, is find whether it's meditation or find some kind of exercise or pastime where you can prepare and ingrain it into your muscle memory. And then obviously being calm under pressure. Sometimes I'm not like, why are you reacting more to this situation? It's like, well, I've seen a lot worse and there's no physical risk going on here. So I managed to stay calm when things get ugly. And then I think more interestingly, I'm really grateful I learned early on, because I was also assigned to the operations part of the squadron. And I learned the importance of not just being top down in style and how you get things done, but really more important is more of a bottom-up approach. So I would start every day with a cup of coffee, talking to the maintenance team, what aircraft are ready to go, what's a maybe, what are the different scenarios we can plan for, before I'd write a typed-down flight schedule, not knowing the true realities of what's going on with everyone. As you would say in the corporate world, from the front office to the back office and everyone in between, what's the reality and how can you design a strategy, a plan based on all of those inputs. And I took that with me into the corporate world and have the pleasure of running several large transformational initiatives. And that style of not just hearing what the top leaders want and trying to get that done, mixing it with, well, what does everyone think is really executable? How could we modify this to get everyone more engaged and excited and participating and wanting to shape it? And I think I enjoy working that way, and I think it served me well throughout my career in financial services.
It's so interesting because I've been listening recently to some people talking about this concept of the level 6. And when you want to really know what's going on in an entity, you have to get to the person, like so essentially 6 levels below. Sometimes the engineer working on this piece of software, and that's where the real intelligence lies. And I like your focus on this bottom up, because essentially if that isn't in place, or if there's something wrong at that level, probably doesn't really matter what you want to do from a top-down perspective.
Well, and then I actually learned from a mentor the importance of not just finding out those people that really know what's going on, but how do you communicate with them? Because their style could be very different from the top leadership team, for example.
So interesting. I'd love to now move to democracy investments, because early on, it seems that finance spoke to you because of the potential to make an impact. Can you just talk us through how you got from there to here?
Absolutely. So from the beginning of my career, I was watching the rise of ESG, and I was watching how upset the millennials are with the state of the world. And from an early point, I was watching impact, thinking this could change the world, and how could I be a part of it? And I was brainstorming probably over the last 8 years. I was brainstorming with my partner, our chief investment officer, on what could we do to have impact that you could measure, would be completely transparent, and would make a difference in the world. Now, in parallel to that, I was hearing from my friends who are still serving their worry about the state of the world, trends in democracy, and the growing power of certain authoritarian states. And we started to brainstorm around, well, how could we do a strategy that would undo these trends? That's when we came up with the idea. And this was just over 2 years ago now. We were brainstorming, and my other partner, our chief economist, he had been modeling coronavirus death rates using the Economist Democracy Index. So the index was literally on his desk while we were brainstorming. He said, hey, what if we used this? It's one of the most robust measures of democracy in the world. They've been publishing country democracy scores since 2006. We could use that to neutrally reweight an international portfolio. So we're not deciding who gets more capital. We're relying on the economists and their years of research to help us build a strategy that would undo the trends of the other all-world ex-US indices that have been allocating more and more capital. We looked at a lot of different platforms and found that SEI was very well suited to be our distributor. And we sit on their trust platform. And fast forward, March of last year, we launched the Democracy International Fund, ticker symbol DMCY, on the New York Stock Exchange. And we're now coming up on 17 months of track record. So that's how we got where we are today. And it's been quite the journey.
And would you say there are any characteristics of those strong democracies versus, say, the authoritarian states? Do you find that there's a clear nexus between investment performance and the stability of the democracies?
Absolutely. So we are seeing since our launch that we have enjoyed significant smart beta relative to the market cap only products. So when you step back and look at it, like democracies, the way their policies work, there are generally no surprises. You know way in advance. For example, we knew way in advance about the housing bubble before the crash in 2007, 2008. That shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone who'd been reading the paper from the prior year. However, did we see that Russia was going to invade Ukraine? Did anyone really see that coming? So we would argue it's not going to be every year, but generally speaking, there is a higher risk in investing in authoritarian states. So our portfolio, which neutrally tilts towards more democratic countries and therefore tilts a bit more towards developed markets than the market cap only products. Not only are we less risky, we are, as I said, if you compare us our last 17 months, we've actually enjoyed over 4%, and we're an index fund. We're 4% better than one of our competitors' products that is much, much larger than us and has been allocating more and more and more to authoritarian states because they are tracking the MSCI All World Index with their product.
And because I think our own ideas and definitions of democracy are perhaps shifting, and we're seeing a quite rapid regime change, how much does the index have to keep recalibrating and introducing new factors or revisiting its assumptions in order to create those scores?
Oh, great question. So, as I said, The Economist has been tracking since 2006, and they use 60 different indicators, and those indicators rarely change. So it is a pretty consistent measure. Now, the country scores change annually. They spend a whole year evaluating every country on those 60 indicators, and then they publish the new score generally at the end of January. So we apply the new country scores to our index. So annually we'll change and adjust, but there's generally not dramatic movements year to year, if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I was wondering how durable those indicators are. In terms of the ESG factors more generally, because obviously governance is now clearly at the forefront when we look at, say, emerging markets. And this came quite, I suppose, very much into focus with the recent divestment from Russian equities and assets in the last, say, 6 months. How do you see investors increasingly incorporate ESG factors into their investment process?
Oh, gosh. Well, interestingly, I think there's been a bit of a backlash in certain areas. I don't know if you saw the Morningstar had an article recently on the outflows, first time in over 5 years. So I think, as with everything, we're swinging one way, we'll swing back. And I feel like there are pockets, certain demographics that are more worried about the state of the world. They're more worried about everything ESG is focused on. Generally speaking, when I'm sharing our strategy, and we're not technically ESG, but we score well in ESG because democratic countries tend to be more focused on ESG. And I see Europeans and Canadians as being much more worried, generally speaking, than your average American. And the regulation that they're putting into place to encourage and incentivize ESG strategies is pretty impressive. And I think here at home, it really varies across the board as to who's taking it seriously and who's trying to implement it. And I've seen a lot of critics who say, oh, it's so hard to measure, it's opaque, you can't really tell what's in there, how do you measure it? If you're screening things out, and those, whatever that factor is you're screening out, if they improve, when do you let them back in? So there's just a lot of controversy around the metrics and measuring the impact and, of course, greenwashing, et cetera. So I think ESG will evolve and eventually the world will be in a better place with it, but it's hard to predict how fast that will happen.
It certainly seems to have got a lot more divisive, the rhetoric, just recently. And I was wondering whether it's in spite of or because of the recent Inflation Reduction Act, which commits $260 billion. Definitely the rhetoric has been increasing recently.
Agreed. And I completely agree with you. And it'll be interesting to see how everything unfolds.
Just wanted to move to one other aspect of ESG now, which is diversity, particularly with respect to financial services industry. But I'd love to know what your assessment of diversity in finance is, and also maybe any experience you had with that in the military and how it compares.
Well, the military has come a long way since I was in terms of getting more women. I think it's up to about 16% of the total U.S. military force is female now. I mean, there's more in the Air Force, less in the Marines, so it varies branch to branch. It's come a long way. They've a ways to go. The book, Diversified, it was written by Ellen Carr and Katrina Gutt-Dudley, who's with Franklin Templeton. And the subtitle is The Big Gender Short in Investment Management. And they've got all kinds of numbers in here, including that less than 10% of fund managers are women. And I think financial services has a long way to go. And when I step back and think about the different cultures I've experienced, one actually good memory that I have from my time in the Navy was during tailhook. I don't know if you remember when that was in the press, but I was literally embarrassed to walk in the post exchange in uniform with my wings on. There was so much back and forth, and did she make it up, and blah, blah, blah. Well, I've never experienced at any other time in my life the top-down change, the mandated change, top-down culturally overnight, couldn't have been more rapid. It went from being, when I was in the Philippines, there were on-base events where people today would be like, did that really happen? To suddenly, everyone had sexual harassment training, more awareness training. We made videos, and the respect I felt and the culture change that I witnessed and experienced firsthand, I want to say it was less than 5 months. And I've never seen any kind of transformation anywhere in the corporate world that was that dramatic and that rapid and that much enforced top. And it was actually, I think it was a great model for what eventually flowed into the corporate world as well.
It's really interesting. It seems it certainly had military efficiency, that change of culture. I'm curious as to how you navigated perhaps leadership roles, garnering respect. Maybe was there any networking component required? Is it strictly meritocracy in the Navy? Whether there's any insights there that we could benefit from in the finance world, where we're also few and far between female leaders, also trying to win respect and advance our careers.
Well, at the time I was in the Navy, women were not allowed in combat. And so our career track was pretty limited. While I was in flight school, your path was if you flew jets or props, you could be an instructor. That's about it. Or a test pilot. I chose helicopters. And so there were missions where I got to get the full workforce specialty and have the same training as my male peers. So that's one reason I chose helicopters, because I wanted to do that. While I was in, they changed the laws. And actually, my roommate from flight school went on to fly jets and be one of the first women to deploy. So I didn't have a lot of women over me to mentor me. I never had one female instructor, actually, all through flight school. But who I did find to mentor and coach me tended to be men with daughters or men with sisters who are pilots or sisters in the service. And generally speaking, I got more support. And I noticed the same correlation when I came into the corporate world, that generally speaking, I found really kind, supportive, and great coaches, men who had daughters or spouses in the corporate world, et cetera. They're just a bit more empathetic and more willing to take the time to mentor me and coach me. Have you noticed any of those correlations yourself?
Yes, it's really interesting. And it's funny, definitely there's men with daughters seem to be quicker to embrace some of the initiatives around diversity in the workplace. and some of the campaigns, etc. Because there's often on social media, maybe a campaign might get a lot of currency. And definitely there's a kind of a projection onto how they'd like their daughters to be treated in the workplace. And that definitely is a link. I suppose we'd like to reach a point where you don't have to have a daughter to be able to imagine what it would be like to have equal opportunity. But I think we have to start somewhere. So I definitely see that. It'd be great to just go back to some personal reflections and talk about what you enjoy most about the world of investing and financial markets now that you've joined it.
Day to day, I really enjoy the team I work with, two of my favorite people in the world. My partners are fantastic. Our growing group of supporters of DMCY just make my day. I enjoy the variety. There's literally never a dull day. And way back when I was deciding to take an honorable discharge from the Navy, I thought, wow, am I going to be bored? And I have to say, I have never had a dull day, and I probably would have been more bored flying a desk where I wasn't out there on the operational front line, which happens as you get more experience. So I have no regrets for where I am right now. I'm really excited about, as I mentioned earlier, our funds outperformance and all the great feedback we've been getting on our strategy, especially, how the world changed over the past 6 months here. The lows, well, I wish our fund was growing faster. I wish we had more AUM. Marketing has been a challenge because we've built a model to compete with the big guys. So we've got to keep our operational costs as low as possible so we can lower our fees. And that organic marketing has been challenging. And then, of course, the markets in general have been challenging, as I'm sure you've experienced as well. But all being said, I'm optimistic, and I feel honored actually to be in the position I am right now. And I think we will all see very interesting times ahead.
And when you look back at your career, were there any key people, mentors? You mentioned not having many female mentors, or just people whose influence made a difference in your course so far?
Yeah, so reflecting back, I think we were talking earlier about the top down, bottom up, which one area really was able to employ that was by my time at Autodesk. And there I had a really special mentor, the woman who hired me. She was basically the COO, and she really took time to coach and mentor me. And I am so appreciative for that. And she was also really good at, she could tell if I was feeling insecure about something or overanalyzing something. And she would say, stop that paranoia in your head. You don't overcomplicate. And that's not what's happening. Just look at the big picture and ignore that little voice in your head that is worried. And yeah, she was a force, and she was definitely one of the trendsetters. So yeah, I didn't have many female mentors in the military, but I had plenty in the corporate world. And then I also am super grateful for my network of veteran friends and my friends who are still serving. I have 3 dear former Navy SEAL friends that also help me keep perspective. And then I've got my friends going all the way back to that all-girls high school who are super supportive and will be friends for life, friends from college. I think all of that, having that strong network, especially if you're going to venture out into new territory, is just even more important to have those trusted relationships that you could lean on and someone you can speed dial when you need something answered fast or you just need feedback, et cetera. I'm really grateful for all of the folks who are still in my life and especially those mentors. I look forward to a day when I have more bandwidth to be able to do that. And I feel like I would not be where I am if it wasn't for the kindness they took to make time for me.
And some of the leadership tomes, Bibles that we look to are penned by military veterans. I'm thinking of General McChrystal.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm sure there have been many kind of models of leadership or words of wisdom or words to live by that you've come across, maybe from your time in the Navy or elsewhere. Is there anything that you can share there in terms of wisdom?
Oh, I've read all those books and I love them. I don't know where to start. In fact, I actually go to see many of those authors, Mattis, McChrystal. I saw them speak live at the Marines Memorial here in San Francisco. Oh, I'm glad we're out of COVID where those can start happening again. But actually, when I saw that when I discussed this, I had to dig deep because there's so many. And I think when I look back at what helped change the course of my life, I have military heritage. My grandfather was a P-38 pilot in World War II. Sadly, he died when I was 3. He was a POW on my mom's side. And then my dad was in the Navy. He was actually an immigrant from Germany, came over when he was 5. He retired as a commander from the Navy, but I had no pressure to join the military from my family, but it's definitely in my blood. But it was actually a book that I found I was 7th grade at the time, that I found in the library a super thick book called Testament of Youth by Vera Brittain. And it's an autobiography of a nurse who served during World War I. They made a lovely movie of it, which I own and I watch every year. The book is outstanding. And when I read it in 7th grade, it inspired me to serve. And there's a quote that I have here. I don't think I could absorb it in my youth, but it really speaks to me now. And it is, when I was a girl, that she's speaking later in life, towards the end of the book, after just incredible experiences of getting herself into Oxford, serving on the front line. And I don't want to ruin the book or movie for anyone that hasn't seen it yet, but this is the quote. When I was a girl, I imagined that life was individual, one's own affair, that the events happening in the world outside were important enough in their own way, but were personally quite irrelevant. Now, like the rest of my generation, I have had to learn again and again the terrible truth that no life is really private or isolated or self-sufficient. People's lives were entirely their own, perhaps, and more justifiably, when the world seemed enormous, and all of its comings and goings were slow and deliberate. But this is no longer, and never will be again, since man's inventions have eliminated so much of distance and time. For better, for worse, we are now, each of us, part of the surge and swell of great economic and political movements, and whatever we do, as individuals or as nations, deeply affects everyone else. That really speaks to me, and I think I've grown to be even more mission-driven than I was in my youth, and that kind of vision really sums it up for me, and that we should all do what we can. And hats off to you for doing this podcast and what you're doing to raise awareness and bring a new lens to diversity in our industry.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. This has been a beautiful conversation. And I have always been so awestruck around the military, and I'm so thankful for their service, but equally for what you've done here, which is to seamlessly integrate lessons from serving in that sense to serving the way we serve, and to looking at finance through that lens has been very eye-opening for me. You brought some great parallels from your former life into your current one. And thank you for opening our eyes to see things a little differently. Thank you for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for all that you do.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.